Okay, guys, this is gonna be my review on Final Fantasy X. I was gonna do Final Fantasy VII review today, but because that review is gonna take a little more time to do, simply because of all the spin-off games and stuff, I'm gonna save that for another day, maybe Tuesday at the latest. Okay. So this review is about Final Fantasy X, and I'll start with the background. Well, the background is that it was released in 2001, and it was the first PlayStation 2 Final Fantasy to be released because, like I said in my first review of 9, and 9 was the last of the PlayStation 1 generation to be released. That was the very last one. And so since the PlayStation 2 at that time was still relatively new, this was the first Final Fantasy game to be released on that platform. Now, a lot of changes went into Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X was the first game to actually have voiceovers, to have voice acting instead of just having the text dialogue. Personally, I always like the text dialogue better. A game like Final Fantasy, you don't need, voice acting for it as long as the story and the dialogue is good enough and the story is good enough to follow. Just personal preference. Everybody has their own taste and opinion on that. Um, One of the other more interesting changes was that Final Fantasy X never actually had a world map. It was kind of like you go from one area to the next. It was more linear, and at first a lot of people didn't like that. Like I didn't really like it at first because how could you have Final Fantasy without a world map to explore? But a lot of things sort of made up for that. The story made up for that. The combat made up for that, especially the side quests. Since this was the first Final Fantasy to have voice acting, it also had one of the, well, at least in the series, one of the most despisable characters in any of the games, which was Tidus or Titus, however you want to pronounce it. It's like there's two different pronunciations for it. Um, the reason why is because as a character, he came off as very, very whiny and annoying. Um, it's kind of like in the beginning of the game he's very immature, then he sort of grows over the whole plot by the end of the game. But still, it didn't change the fact that at least as a protagonist, he wasn't very likable. The story was um revolved more around Yuna than anything else in Tidus. Tidus was more or less just stuck there for the ride. The story itself was very good, but I think they should have just done a lot better of a job making a protagonist than they made Tidus. So let's talk about the story and characters first. Okay, this story is sort of, well, it's actually pretty funny because since every other Final Fantasy has sort of a theme going for it, like 8 had his theme of time, 9 had his theory about like life itself, like if you're manufactured, can you actually live a fulfilling life? And 7 was kind of about like spirit energy and the planet itself. But Final Fantasy X was more focused around religion more than anything else. It was more focused around this religion called Yevon, the Church of Yevon, I should say. And a lot of people will disagree, but it's kind of Square's jab at sort of things like Christianity and organized religion. A lot of people sort of get offended by saying that, but being Catholic myself, I really don't see it as an offense. They do make a lot of interesting points about religion because basically, well, of course, this review has spoilers. It's basically focused about the world's religion, which was Yevon, which is basically based on a bunch of lies and bullshit. Basically, the world is being ravaged by this creature known as Sin, a gigantic floating whale, which turns out to be just one huge ass summon, and that was created by the person who the church was centered around was Yevon. As it basically turns out, everybody sort of looks at Yevon like a benevolent god, but in truth, he was a person who couldn't, accept the fact that he lost a major war between Zanark and Bevelle because Bevelle obviously had better technology, and it was kind of, the world was changing in a way where it's kind of like our world, where as years go on, our technology gets better and it becomes more prominent in lives. And you haven't sort of had that idea that, oh, if you use technology, it's evil, it's not how life's supposed to be. So the whole premise behind sin is like, sin is around because the people of the world, spirit, at least, I'm sorry, I had to crack my neck there, of spirit have to atone for their sins, which really doesn't make a lot of sense because the only sins that were around was because of, obviously using technology for war and stuff. But in a lot of ways, it didn't make a lot of sense. And as you go through the story, you kind of figure out by going from temple to temple, as you get more information about it, that the church is basically just bullshit. It's just straight up bullshit. And I guess for reading a lot of posts online, a lot of people get offended by it because there are a lot of religious people who do play these games and they think it's offensive that they're sort of taking shots at the church. But honestly, I don't see it as really too bad of a bad thing because it's thinking outside the box, at least in my opinion, for making a plot. So, like I said, the characters we had a different set of characters this time than any of the games. You had one of the coolest characters of the series, which was Oron, because of, well, he's basically an older samurai who, spoiler, he's an unsent spirit who's really dead because of the fact that he went up against sort of, I call her the princess of the church, I guess, Yunalesca. You know, before the game took place, Oron, Yuna's dad, Braska, and Jecht, Titus's dad, go on the pilgrimage to defeat Sin, and by the end of it, well, the way it kind of works is that Braska gets sacrificed for the final Aeon, and someone else becomes Sin, which in this case was Jecht, who becomes Sin, and is Titus's dad. And Oren gets killed because he basically feels that he needs to avenge his dead friends, and by trying to attack Yunalesca, she basically struck him down, and he became an unsent. Which is why, when you get to the part, for those who have played it, when you get to the part of the far plane, he doesn't want to go in. Oren doesn't feel good by being near that because obviously he's an unsent. We had an interesting antagonist in the story. You had Seymour, who was sort of a mix between the Guado and the human races, who was a maester in this church. From the beginning, you knew he was going to be an antagonist, but the problem with Seymour is his motives didn't make a whole lot of sense. That he wanted to become Sin and end everything. It seems like that typical antagonist thinking where you have to destroy everything for whatever reason. Also, as antagonist, you obviously had Yevon because he started everything, and that and Jecht is considered the antagonist because and throughout the whole story you see this hatred between Titus and his dad, and how Titus can't stand him, and how he ends up becoming Sin. The only good thing that Titus was in the game for was the obvious romance part between him and Yuna, which I don't know if it was as good as Eight's romance between Squall and Rinoa, but it was very prevalent that it was there. And by the end of the game, for those of you who know, it was probably the saddest ending out of all the Final Fantasies up to that point. Well, obviously because Titus and Jecht and his vision of Zanarkand was just a huge dream of the faith. Basically, all the people who Yevon sacrificed for the summoning of Sin, had this perfect visioning of Zanarkand at its peak. Because at that point, back then in the war, Zanarkand was losing, and the city was gonna get destroyed. That's why in the beginning you see Sin attack the city, and Titus and Oren gets sucked inside time warp by Sin, and that's how he ends up into the 1,000 years later in the world of Spira. It was really sad, even though I didn't really like Titus. It was really sad because everything. He was basically just a dream. him, his dad, Zanarkand were basically just dreams of the faith. And after finally defeating Sin and Yevon, obviously they disappear after that point, which was very sad. I'll give it that. It had the saddest ending in any Final Fantasy. But, you see, the linearity part of it, at first I didn't like it because it's like, how can you not have an RPG like Final Fantasy and not have like an open world world map to explore? That's the thing I'm going to get into next is the gameplay. Well, the gameplay it still had the turn-based combat of the previous Final Fantasies, but what they actually had this time that actually I thought was really cool. It was a good idea. Was the fact that you could switch characters in and out of battles at a time. You can only have three characters in a battle, but you could switch characters back and forth. I thought it was very, very good, and you can actually see the turns coming up as well as the enemies' turns. I thought that was actually very clever to do that. And it also had the sphere grid system, which basically you get spheres from battles, finding them, obviously when you're traveling, whatever. And that's basically the way that you level up your characters. The XP for this was kind of like, if you complete a battle, right? You get sphere levels, which means that in every level that you have is the amount of spaces you can make on the sphere grid, kind of like a board game. Whereas if you have five sphere levels, you can go 5 different places back and forth or whatever, as long as you have the right spheres on the sphere grid. And it was one of the only other Final Fantasies where you could actually max out everybody's stat. In 8, yeah, you could junction spells and stuff, but you can't max out everything. But in this, though, if you have the time to do it, like, the last playthrough I did, I spent almost 100 hours just grinding and getting everybody's stats maxed out, which does take a long time. And it was the only, I shouldn't say only, it was the first game that you could actually break the damage limit and the HP limit for your characters, which I thought was actually very, very cool as well. Some people will go on and say that, the sphere grid, you can't really customize the characters the way you want. I sort of disagree with that because you can go into other person's sphere grids. For example, the sphere grid is this huge grid, and each character has their own section for different things. For example, Tidus has had a lot of speed, whereas Wakka's had a lot of accuracy, and Auron's, obviously, he had a lot of power. And you can get key spheres to open up the locks to go into other characters' sphere grids and just basically just max out your levels. I thought that was actually really, really cool to do that because by the end of the game, you could just be maxed out for everything, and every other enemy could just be a joke. A lot of people didn't like it. They didn't think that it was gonna be that that you really can't customize characters like that. But I thought it was actually very interesting. You could have more than 2 people being like mage type characters, which was cool. Which also sort of goes. Well, we should go into presentation next, obviously. Well, the presentation, since it was the first Final Fantasy to be on the PlayStation 2, it really tested the limits of the PlayStation 2, especially with graphics. The graphics were nothing like Final Fantasy had seen. This wasn't, 7's, blocky, pixelated characters. These characters were a lot more realistic in terms of modeling. And the backgrounds were very beautiful. And actually, quite recently, because there's several different versions of the game. You have the international version of the older game where it has the Dark Aeons, it has Penance, the super boss. But recently they came out, they did a remaster where they basically just made it HD and added some different features to it. For example, it was released actually this past year for the PlayStation 3 and the Vita. I have it for the Vita because I've always wanted to play 10 as a portable game. The difference really was that the graphics were a lot better. The music was a little bit different, and it actually, at least for the Vita, had a new feature where you could touch the screen, press the button, and it'll heal your entire party without going into the menu, which I thought was actually very useful, especially when you're level grinding. And it also had the international versions of monsters. It had Penance, it had the Dark Aeons, which, I mean, the super bosses in this were no joke. It wasn't really like an Ozma where he had no ATB and he just kept taking turns with the turns. These guys were hard. It took a while just to beat them all, but I actually managed to do it. I think they did a really good job, and the presentation people got excited mainly for the game for the presentation, the graphics wise, as well as the voice acting, which was also, it was decent. The voice acting wasn't best, but it was decent. So let's go and talk about the music. The music, it wasn't so, well, at least what I remember, and I looked up too. It wasn't solely by Uematsu. Uematsu did a lot of the music, but he also had a couple of other composers. I don't have my phone right here to look it up, but he didn't do all the music by himself this time. And the music still was very excellent and it had a lot of great tracks. Um, so let's go into and talk about the side quests. This game was chock full of side quests. Oh my god. Let's see. In fact, I hope I can remember them all. You had the Monster Arena, where you use special weapons to capture monsters and bring them to this arena. And each different kind and area and species, you unlock like a super boss, sort of. And when you beat all these different super bosses, you get the ultimate super boss for the Monster Arena. And the reason why I like the Monster Arena is because it had a lot of tools you can get to really jack your character stats. For example, one of them, I forgot which one, who has the items to make where you can break the HP limit and your damage limit for different characters. Um, you also had the lightning dodger side quest, which I never really did because it was too much of a pain in the ass to do. You had the butterfly catch one, which was another pain in the ass. The chocobo racing gets the trainer. What else? I'm trying to think. You had Blitzball, obviously. Blitzball was huge in this game. I really wasn't a fan of Blitzball. I think it was overly complicated, and I didn't really find it to be really fun. I only did it really once when I did a playthrough. I was just my thing is that whenever I do playthrough, I don't want to spend extra time on things like that. I just make my own ultimate weapons. Like, oh, some people say, oh, but you didn't get the ultimate weapons. I said, well, listen, you could just make it yourself if you have the items. That's what I did, and it works just as good. You have the right items to make the weapons, and why not? And it's just because, yeah, it had a lot of side quests, but some of them were a real pain in the ass to do, and it was just, some of it was just tedious. But the game still was a lot of fun. The one thing that I thought didn't really fit into this game was the whole temple puzzle solving things. Now, the premise was that each area had its own temple. Well, mostly every area had its own temple. And you sort of had to take spheres and put them in the right places like a puzzle, and you could unlock like an item and get through and get the Aeon, the summon. I thought it was just, it didn't really fit into the game, kind of. It was very awkward, I guess you could say. It was very awkward. It was just neat. I felt like it was just thrown in there just because I think they could have been done a lot better. Like, you have to battle somebody or another summoner or something to get it. I think they would have fit a lot more with the theme of the game. That puzzle, I didn't really like it. Some people did. I just found it kind of tedious and it didn't fit with the story. A lot of people will kind of disagree with me, but I think it had one of the coolest final dungeons. Like, the final dungeon is, okay, basically before you get to the final dungeon, you basically beat Sin and you go inside of Sin's mouth, in his body. And inside of his body is basically the final dungeon. A lot of people thought it was kind of awkward. I didn't find it as awkward as Sevens. I found Sevens to be really awkward and it just didn't really fit. Kind of like how you went from one area to the next and they go completely different. I thought it was kind of creative to do it inside of Sin because you had a city inside of I thought the music was kind of cool and the enemies, it was good to grind. But it had probably one of the worst final bosses. Basically, you fight Yevon. He looks like a gigantic tick, which kind of fits with the premise because Yevon is kind of a parasite. on humanity in that world. It sort of fits, but basically you fight him and you can't lose. Basically, you get killed, you have auto life on you automatically for everybody. That pissed a lot of people off, and I didn't really like it too much because I thought it sort of killed the momentum. It killed the climax of the game because you find out how how evil Yu Yevon really was, and that the whole church is basically a lie, and then you fight him, and it really wasn't satisfying that you can get killed and just come back and you can't lose. On top of which, he wasn't even a hard boss to even begin with. There was no challenge behind him. I found more challenge in Seymour. Because Seymour, you go through the story, you fight him a bunch of times. I thought his hardest form was probably Seymour Flux before you get to Xanarkin, because he was kind of cheap. But I found him to be more challenging than Yu Yevon was. And hell, even when you fight Jecht and his form, you know, he was more challenging than Yu Yevon. I mean, I'm sorry I'm kind of babbling on here, guys. I'm a little tired. It's kind of shitty outside. Um, I like 10 a lot. At first, I didn't really like it when I was younger. Because when I was younger when it came out, I thought it was sort of too far away from what Final Fantasy truly was, at least in Sakaguchi's view of 9 being his favorite. But I really, it grew on me, and I like the game now, especially for the story. I found the story to be very interesting, but it kind of had the same sort of symptoms as 9, whereas there was a lot of things that happened pre-game that we don't get to see in the actual game that we actually have to go and look up on a Wikia. But one thing I will say, I don't know yet if I'm going to do a review of 10-2, because I've only played through it once, and honestly, it's just nothing but pure fan service. I really didn't like it at all. It had a good combat system, and the gameplay wasn't bad, but the story was just... It was pure fan service. I mean, basically, throughout the whole game, you can hear everybody just fapping. You know what I'm talking about. Not to insult anybody, that's just my personal opinion about it. They did the HD remake really good, I think. I thought it was very well done. They didn't break the bank for it. It was only $40. You know, they weren't trying to charge full price for it, which I thought was very smart by them. I'm just trying to think. No, I guess I covered everything, I think. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm gonna try to do a review of 7, probably by Tuesday. I'm gonna say it's gonna take me a little longer to do it, because of the other spin-offs during that game. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this review, and I'll see you guys next time.